Welcome to the Money Report Unfiltered. My name is James, and here we talk about personal finance, how to save money, how to budget money, and how to invest your money. We talk about the things you need to know to be successful financially. And today we are talking about inflation. So the consumer prices have risen at the fastest pace in 7 months. This is as of October 2019. When we talk about inflation, we're talking about really the cost of living. And so what this says is the cost of living has increased over the past 12 months by 1.8%. And again, this is the highest rate it's been in the past 7 months, but it's still well below last year's peak of 3%. And I think a lot of people know that the Federal Reserve sets a target of 2%. And so when they are targeting 2%, the media reports on the cost of living increase. They talk about the consumer price increase. In this case, again, it's 1.8%. That's the highest rate it's been in the last 7 months. But if inflation is under 2%, it's under the Federal Reserve's target of 2%, then why has there been all of this talk about cutting the Fed funds rate, cutting interest rates, and all of this concern about the economy and whether or not we are heading into a recession in 2020 or perhaps already in a recession here in 2019? Remember, there's a delay in when the GDP numbers are reported. So we could very well be in a recession right now, and those numbers would come out later in, say, Q1. They'll report on the Q4 numbers. So if we've had a decline in GDP, that won't be actually reported until next quarter. So we might be in a recession. Nobody really knows. It just kind of depends on how retail sales shape up. So again, why all of this talk about how the economy is doing and why the Federal Reserve is now cutting rates? They've said that rate cuts are now on hold and that the economy is not looking too stable at this point. There's really not much more they can do from a Federal Reserve perspective on supporting the economy. But again, the consumer price index is under 2%. However, the core inflation rate is at the highest rate it's been since 2008. It's at the highest rate it's been since September 2008. That is not really talked about too much in mainstream media, right? When you go to mainstream media, or even if you're just sort of a passive watcher of economic news, and these reports come out that say, oh, the consumer price index is under 2%, or the cost of living is under the Federal Reserve target of 2%. Well, that's actually only part of the story. The other part of the story is core inflation. Now, with regard to core inflation, the trend has not really been favorable. And I think that's one of the statistics that the Federal Reserve is watching pretty closely. It may have contributed to why they've decided to do this about face and start cutting rates here in 2019, because the trend again for core inflation really hasn't been good. And what we have to understand here is the difference between the consumer price index or cost of living inflation versus the core inflation. So core inflation is just the change in goods and services, but it does not include changes in prices from food and energy. Now, that's very important to understand. Food and energy prices, they are not included in this calculation because their prices can be very volatile and fluctuate wildly. And you know that just going to the gas station to fill up your car. Sometimes the prices are high, sometimes the prices are low. It's just, but you still fill up, right? So core inflation is one of the major factors to look at when you're looking at the cost of goods and services without the cost of energy or food. And again, the trend of core inflation has not been favorable. The core CPI rose 2.4% compared to 2.2% in July of this year, July of 2019. And that was the highest it had been since July of 2018. But here's the thing that's important to know. At 2.4% of core inflation, that's the highest it had been since September 2008. And so here we are in this longest bull market run in the stock market in history. We've got a 10-year plus economic expansion, and yet the core inflation at 2.4% is the highest it had been since the economic crisis of 2008. Now, that's not really discussed anywhere in the mainstream media. When people say, oh, cost of living is under 2%. Again, that's not telling the whole story. You have to think, why is the Fed cutting rates? It's not just because there is pressure from the administration to cut rates. There is actual economic data that suggests the economy is slowing, inflation is rising, and the Federal Reserve took action. Now, sadly, what is also not really talked about in mainstream media is how inflation relates to wage increases or wage growth. And inflation and wage growth are two critical indicators to look at as it relates to the health of the consumer. Because if you think about prices going up, but your wages aren't really going up, that doesn't put you in a really good position in terms of your purchasing power. And in this case, related to the increase of both cost of living and also core CPI, after adjusting for inflation, hourly wages fell 0.2%. Of course, they have risen this year by a rate of 1.2%. But when you compare that to inflation, and just compare that to the consumer price index. So if the consumer price index is up 1.8%, but your hourly wages fell 2%, how is that helping the consumer? It's not. And it's even worse when you look at core CPI, or the core consumer price index, which again excludes food and energy. So that is up at 2.4%, the highest it had been since September 2008. And you compare that to a decline in hourly wages. Of course, these stats change month to month, but you have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. We're heading into the holiday shopping season for Q4. The U.S. economy is widely reported dependent on the consumer spending. It's about 2/3 of the U.S. economy. So you have prices increasing, you have wages not keeping up with those price increases, and yet the National Retail Federation is still reporting that they expect an increase in retail sales by 3.8 to 4.2%. My question is, where is that growth going to happen? And unfortunately, I think what a lot of people are going to do this year is just add to the consumer debt. I've talked about this before. We are now over $4 trillion in consumer debt, and that number just keeps getting bigger. As we head into the holiday shopping season, we have higher prices, wages not keeping up with it. We've got expectations of, let's say, 4% in retail sales growth for Q4, and all of that is probably, or a large part of that, is probably going to go right back on consumer debt. So what does all of this mean? Again, we talk about personal finance here, and as you head into the holiday shopping season, just be very cautious. I would encourage everybody to go into this holiday shopping season and just be smart about how you spend your money. Don't overextend yourself. The holiday shopping season, it's easy to get caught up in the spending, but just think about the broader perspective of the economy here. At some point, all of this is going to come to an end with this longest economic expansion, longest bull market. And if you're going into the holiday season and you're going to add a whole bunch of credit card debt just to get through the season, at some point, it's going to have to be paid back. So just think about your spending, be smart about your spending for Q4, enjoy the holiday shopping season. But again, think about the broader economic news that's out there, and how prices are increasing, wages aren't keeping up with it, and you might want to just be very cautious about what you do here in Q4. So with that said, thank you for listening, and please remember to hit the like and subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you get notified of when we release another video. And until next time, this is the Money Report Unfiltered.